Welcome to Mind Your Being. Every time I record a new episode, I just feel so grateful for you all listening, whether you're a regular listener or you're new here. Welcome to this little community that we're creating. I appreciate you taking time out of your day, wherever you are in the world. So here at Mind Your Being, I'm exploring the science and stories of being human, how we can navigate life, health and well-being with a little more awareness, definitely some self-compassion and also curiosity. Today's episode is a little bit different to what I've presented so far on the podcast, and it's definitely one of the most personal episodes I've recorded. And when I started this podcast, I wasn't sure whether I would ever publicly talk about this chapter of my life. And not because I'm uncomfortable discussing relationships, but because this story involves people I deeply care about. And also because the podcast isn't about me. It's about raising awareness, sharing ideas, and encouraging all of us to take actions that support our well-being in whatever way is personally meaningful to us. But part of hosting a podcast called Mind Your Being is being willing to talk openly about experiences I've had that may also resonate with you. And I do this to help us better understand ourselves and one another, to try and reduce some of the stigma and shame that we all face as human beings, and to remind ourselves that we're often far less alone than we think. And although this episode might sound like the story about the ending of a relationship, at its heart, it's really about something much broader. It's about what I learned when I found myself facing one of the most difficult decisions of my life to date. It's a story about uncertainty. It's a story about self-trust. It's a story about how difficult it can be to make decisions when there isn't an obvious right answer. And perhaps most importantly, it's a story about what I learned after spending years asking myself the same question over and over again. And that question was, should I stay or should I leave? Around 4 years before my previous long-term relationship ended, I found myself sitting in a counsellor's office for the first time in my life. And for context, that counsellor appointment was probably around 13 years ago now. And at that point, I sought support because I was feeling really stressed, like most of the time. I felt restless, uneasy. I wasn't feeling like myself. As many of you will be able to relate to, I was juggling work, I was raising 2 young children, managing a household, and trying to keep all the plates spinning in the air at the same time. And hindsight's great, right? Because looking back now, I can also see something that I couldn't see then. I was almost certainly perimenopausal. And at that time, I didn't even know what perimenopause was. I had no idea. I certainly didn't understand the impact hormonal changes can have on our mood, anxiety, irritability, and our sense of well-being. I thought I was going to counselling to understand why I felt so unsettled, why I was feeling so irritable and stressed all the time. But somewhere during that first session, I realised there was a much bigger question sitting underneath everything else. I wasn't simply unhappy, I was questioning my relationship. And I remember the counsellor saying something. She said I didn't seem ready to leave the relationship at that point in time. I still had doubts. I still had uncertainty. And she was right. At that moment, I definitely wasn't ready. I had 2 young children. I was terrified of making the wrong decision. I was terrified of hurting people that I love. And I was terrified of creating for my children the same kind of broken family experience that I believed I had grown up with. Now, I put the phrase broken family in inverted commas because I no longer see families that change after separation or divorce that way. I no longer see it like that. But at the time, that's what I believed. And I remember leaving that appointment, walking back to my car and I just had a fleeting thought, something like, I know the relationship will end one day. And then almost immediately, I pushed the thought away. I didn't want that to be true, and I wasn't ready to accept that that would be true, because that day was not going to be the day that the relationship ended. And so began years of going back and forth. Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever been stuck between two choices? And not because you didn't understand the options, but because you could see valid reasons on both sides. That was me. That was where I was at. This went on for around 4 years. I think nearly every day I would have thoughts like, I'm not happy. I think I want something different. I think I want more emotional connection. I wonder if I could be happier. And then almost immediately I'd have other thoughts like, well, he's a good man. He's a wonderful father. No one will take care of me the way he does. And then I started asking myself questions like, well, what if I regret leaving? What if I make a terrible mistake? Back and forth, over and over again on a daily basis. The same conversation, the same thoughts, the same questions, the same fears. And as I said, this went on for years, and it was so exhausting. And one of the things I've learned since then is that human beings are naturally wired to prefer certainty over uncertainty. Psychologists have found that uncertainty activates many of the same threat responses in the brain as if you were facing physical danger. Our brains are prediction machines. They like knowing what comes next. Even when we're unhappy, we often prefer a familiar discomfort to an unfamiliar future. And I think that's where I was stuck. I wasn't choosing between a good option and a bad option. And I didn't realize this at the time, but I was choosing between a known life and an unknown one. And the unknown felt terrifying because there was no certainty. I didn't even know what it would look like. Maybe you felt that too. And not just in relationships, maybe in a career, a friendship, a health decision, a move between houses, a move between locations. And I want to ask you to reflect for yourself. Have you ever found yourself arguing both sides of a decision so many times that you no longer know which voice is yours or which voice to listen to? That was definitely me. I could make a compelling case for staying, for no change. And then 5 minutes later, I could make an equally compelling case for leaving. It was exhausting, back and forth. And it wasn't because I didn't care. It's because I cared so much, and because both paths involved loss. I think many of us assume difficult decisions become easier once we gather enough information. I know I'm like that. I try and analyse the pros and cons of each side, too many times. But some decisions aren't information problems. Sometimes having more information doesn't actually help us make the decision. And I think that's because they're not information problems, they're uncertainty problems. Sometimes we stay stuck not because we don't know what we want, but because we fear what might happen if we pursue it. That fear and that uncertainty keeps us stuck, analysing information over and over again. And another thing I can see clearly now is how much perfectionism was influencing my thinking. As many regular listeners know, I've lived with OCD for much of my life, and alongside OCD comes a tendency toward perfectionism. And looking back, I think I spent years trying to make the perfect decision, perfect in inverted commas, the decision that would protect everyone, the decision that would guarantee happiness, the decision that would avoid pain, the decision that would ensure nobody got hurt. But eventually I realised something, and it's something I didn't know at the time. There is no perfect decision. There's only a decision at a point in time. Every possible path involved uncertainty. Every path involved loss. Every path involved risk. And all my perfectionism was really doing was keeping me trapped. I think that's one of the greatest illusions perfectionism sells us, that if we think long enough, analyze hard enough, and gather enough information, we'll arrive at certainty. We'll arrive at the perfect decision. But life doesn't work that way. At some point, we make decisions based on who we are, what we know, and what we feel at that particular moment in time. And then we move forward, having made that decision at that time. One of the biggest reasons I struggled to make the decision was because there wasn't a villain in my story. I think this was one of the most confusing parts for me. Because culturally, we're often told stories about relationships ending because somebody did something wrong. There's an affair, there's dishonesty, there's abuse, there's some obvious event that everyone can point to and say, well, that's why the relationship ended. But what happens when there isn't? What happens when two decent people have simply grown in different directions? What happens when somebody has been a good partner in many ways, but something still doesn't feel right? And for a long time, I felt so guilty even asking those questions, almost as though my feelings needed to pass some sort of test before they became valid, as though I needed to prove to myself that I was unhappy enough. And I think many of us do that. We minimize our feelings because somebody else has it worse. We tell ourselves we should be grateful. We tell ourselves we have no right to feel the way we feel. But feelings aren't logical arguments. They're information. They're not instructions. They're not facts, but they're information worth paying attention to. My former partner is a good man. He's a wonderful father. There was no abuse, no infidelity, no major betrayal. We worked hard, we raised our children together, we shared many good years. And that's what made the decision so difficult. I think I was trying to justify my feelings. I had an underlying belief that people only leave bad relationships, bad in inverted commas again. I had an underlying belief that you needed a really good reason to end a relationship that was otherwise fine. I had the belief that things needed to be objectively terrible. But life is often more complicated than that. Sometimes a relationship can be good on paper and still not feel right for one or both people. Sometimes you can love someone and still feel disconnected. Sometimes you can deeply care for someone and still want something different. And perhaps the hardest lesson for me was recognizing that my feelings mattered. Not more than anyone else's, but they mattered too. My peace of mind mattered. My emotional well-being mattered. My sense of connection mattered. And this is a big one for me. My feelings of contentment mattered. Toward the end of that period, which lasted around 4 years, I developed a stomach ulcer. And if you've ever experienced this, you know it's incredibly painful. So looking back during this period of back and forth, I can see how much stress I had been carrying. Now, I can't say exactly what role stress played in my ulcer, but I do know this. For years, I had ignored my own emotional well-being. I had ignored the whispers, the little signs that something needed attention. And sometimes our bodies seem to find ways of getting our attention when we've become very good at ignoring ourselves. Can you relate to this? Can you relate to some of these feelings or questions that I've raised here? So eventually, after years of questioning, doubting, and analyzing, the relationship ended. It was painful. At times it was messy. There were difficult conversations. There were tears. There were fears. And there was grief. As is the case for a lot of people when a relationship ends, there is a grieving period. But once the decision was made, there was also relief. And not because the outcome was easy, far from it, but because that questioning, that back and forth, finally stopped. That exhausting mental tug of war was over. I'd made the decision. And for the first time in years, I wasn't asking myself whether to stay or go. The decision had been made, and I could finally start moving forward. I could stop focusing so much mental attention on one decision. And today, many years later, things have worked out well. Our children are thriving. My former partner and I found a way to co-parent. So life looks different than I once imagined. But here's the thing, different isn't always bad. Sometimes different is simply different. And sometimes the thing we fear most turns out to be something we are capable of navigating. If you're listening and you're wrestling with a difficult decision, I want to be clear about something. I'm not advising you to leave a relationship, and I'm not telling you to make a particular decision. Only you can know what is right for you and your circumstances. But maybe this episode might encourage you to stop dismissing your feelings. Maybe to get curious about what your feelings are trying to tell you. Maybe to acknowledge uncertainty without letting it run your life. And maybe to recognize that there will never be a perfect answer. There will only be the answer that feels most aligned with who you are at a particular point in time. For years, I thought I was waiting for certainty. I eventually realized what I needed wasn't certainty. What I needed was trust. Trust in myself. Trust that I had the capability to figure things out as I went along. And one of the things I've realized since then is that making a difficult decision doesn't necessarily mean you're certain. In most cases, you're not. Sometimes it simply means you've become more willing to tolerate uncertainty. And just saying that sounds a bit nerve-wracking to me. Tolerate uncertainty. That can be really, really hard. But sometimes I don't think we give ourselves enough credit at our ability to tolerate some uncertainty. And perhaps that's what courage looks like in many situations. Not the absence of fear, because I think when you're on the verge of any change, whether it's minor or major, there's always going to be a level of fear. And having courage doesn't mean you have complete confidence. It's not knowing exactly how everything will work out. It's taking a step forward despite not knowing. For me, it was trusting that I could navigate whatever came next. Trust that even if things became difficult, I would find my way through. And perhaps that's the reflection I'd like to leave you with today. Is there a question in your life that you've been asking yourself repeatedly? A question that you've been carrying for months or perhaps years? Maybe the answer isn't to think harder. Maybe the answer is to listen more carefully. Because sometimes, beneath all the noise, the fear and the doubt, a part of us already knows. Or that part just needs you to carefully listen to the whispers. And if you do find yourself in this situation right now or later down the track, I really hope you can be kind to yourself along the way, to listen to your feelings and to know there is no perfect decision. Thank you so much for being here at Mind Your Being. If today's episode resonates with you, I'd love to hear from you. You could send a message through social media, or there's a contact form on our website, mindyourbeing.com.au. I really get so excited every time I check the podcast host downloads and I see that people from all around the world are finding Mind Your Being. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen today. So until next time, I hope you can offer yourself a little self-compassion, and I hope you take care and mind your being. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Mind Your Being podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful, please follow the show wherever you get your podcasts and share it with a friend who might enjoy it too. If you have a moment, please leave a quick review. It really helps others discover the podcast. Thanks again for being here. Take care, and until next time, mind your being.